All right. So we are in Leviticus, vaYiqra, chapter 19. We have probably been overdoing the the laws contained in this chapter because these are the laws of by this is a nation. The whole chapter is a nation. It's not meant to be in depth. I can't even say that word right. But we can get these things down, it would help us really be self-aware. I think that in our work today, one of the things that I see is missing with so many people is self-awareness. They'll complain about somebody said this or did that or didn't say this or didn't do that, and yet they're guilty of the very thing they're complaining about. In fact, you'll find that a great deal of the time, the thing that people that whatever your pet peeve is, you're probably guilty of that. You know what I'm saying? It's not a human thing. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not trying to feel bad. Self-reflection is a big part of living according to God's law. It is a big part of us imitating God Himself. And for the Christians, if you want to imitate the guy you call Jesus, we call Yeshua because that was actually his name. Um, well, he lived by these laws. There was never any point in his life where he did not live according to these laws. So, if you're trying to imitate him, this is a good section uh, of of the Bible, of what you call the Old Testament, to really become familiar with. And you'll find that there is a section in, where was that? I think it's in the book of Acts. They get together and they're having this big conflab because they don't know what to do with they call them Gentiles in the English translation, but trust me, they're talking about Jews, not non-Jews. The people that were called Gentiles in that time were Jews who didn't speak Hebrew, or Jews who lived among the nations. Gentile. That, I don't know why Gentile became the word, because the word should have been nation. In other words, if you were a Jew and you lived in Italy, as opposed to Jerusalem or Israel, anywhere in Israel, you were called a Gentile. Well, goim in plural, but they said that because you lived among the nations, you know, as opposed to living in Israel, because it was the only, as far as Judaism was concerned, it was the only real nation, right? So it was the home, and anything else was just called a nation. So the people, they began to just call them goi or goim in plural, and that just means nation. So if you're a Jew that lived in Italy, you were called a Gentile. If you were a Jew that even lived in Israel, but you lived in a place where you had no rabbi and you had no synagogue, and especially if you didn't speak English, because where you lived, maybe they spoke Greek, let's say, you were called a Gentile. And so when they're talking about that in this letter, called the letter of the Acts, ACTS, uh, these are the people they're talking about. They're not talking about non-Jews. And the argument is not over whether people should be circumcised or not. All of the men were circumcised. They still did that even though they lived outside of the city. The circumcision and the uncircumcision was another way of saying Jew or Gentile. It was exactly the same thing. So if you were of the circumcision or you were called circumcised, they said that about women. The women weren't circumcised. The circumcision just meant that you were living according to God's law, that you were truly Jewish. And if you were of the uncircumcision, even though you were circumcised, you were called the uncircumcision because, well, you didn't speak the Hebrew language, you didn't live in Israel, or if you did live in Israel, you didn't have a rabbi or a synagogue. It's that simple. So they were never talking about non-Jews in that letter. And so they say these are the things that these people who have now, from the outskirts of town without the synagogues and all that, now they're coming into town, they want to come into the synagogue. Well, that was actually against the rules. So these guys, the followers of Yeshua, of Jesus, had now taken over synagogues. They were in charge of them. And according to the New Testament letters, they were. And there's actually I want to say extracurricular, that's not the right word, extra biblical sources that seem to say the same thing, that the followers of Yeshua had in fact taken over the overseeing of the synagogues in Jerusalem and beyond. And so they were trying to decide, well, should these people who want to live according to the Torah but have lived outside of the Torah because of no rabbi and no synagogue their whole lives, should we let them in to our synagogues or not? And they said yes. The answer was yes, they should. But these people needed to know some fundamental things before they started entering into the synagogues and trying to enter into Jewish life. They're based on this. This is where these ideas came from, is this very chapter. And by the way, this chapter is based on the 10 Commandments. I'm going to go over that at some point. I'm going to make the comparisons. I think I'm going to wait until the end to do that. But you're looking at, so the 10 Commandments, those are just a summation. There are not just 10 commandments, 10 different categories, which is why they're called the 10 Devarim instead of, in Hebrew, they use the word Devarim, which means word, or words in plural. That's not commandments. That's not the word for commandments, right? You understand that? That does not mean commandments. 10 words. Well, what does that equate to in English? 10 categories. The English translation should have said categories. So this is a summation. And so they've taken pieces and parts out of the different categories and they've summed them up, just like the 10 so-called commandments are 10 categories. And then you have your laws fall within those 10 categories to help us to understand how to live out the law. For instance, these here, they start off with reverence your mother and your father and the Sabbath. Well, one of the 10 commandments is keep the Sabbath day holy, right? And so the reverence of mother, father, and Sabbath are being put together in this summation. And then the next thing was that you didn't bow your heart and your mind to an image, and that you didn't make images. Does it start sound like the 10 Commandments to you? It should, because they're all based on the laws that fall within those categories. And so when you get to the letter of Acts, they're doing exactly the same thing, but they broke it down to 5 different things. You hear many Christians over the years said, there's 4 necessary things. No, there's not. There's 5. Read it again. Even in your English translation, there are 5 necessary things. The reason why people tend to miss that is because the 5th one is in the next verse. And for some reason, American Christians seem to think that you can't have a 5th category unless it's in the same verse. I don't know. I've never understood that, but they name off 5 things. So they're breaking the 10 categories down to 5, right? But the way they write them, it covers all 10. And that's kind of the same thing that's happening here. The way they were written out, they cover all the different categories. So this is just helping you to live your everyday life, right? So what got us into the summation of the summation of the summation was verse 21. And the guilty will be brought to Yahweh to the entrance of the Ohel Moed with a ram for his guilt, right? So my question at that point was guilty of what? And if you'll recall from last week, of any of the things that preceded this verse and any of the things that follow it within the same, we'll say chapter this time, because basically they broke up the chapters for the most part. The translation into English has broken up the chapters properly. Not always. Sometimes, just because of the length of what would be a chapter, they will break it up into one or two more chapters. And that has done nothing but sow confusion among the Western readers because they don't get that all of that stuff went together. It shouldn't be intermingled with other things. So, anyway, within this chapter on everyday holiness, the things that we need to keep in mind every day and live according to every day, and then work out the details as we. So everything that's in that is found in chapter 19. So we go to verse 22. I've made a bit of a mistake. Hang on here. No, I just need to adjust. I hit the button instead of my screen is missing is what I'm trying to tell you. Forgot I was experimenting here. Oh, I can't get my corner thing. Oh, I guess it'll probably be all right. There we go. Sorry, I couldn't see all my words. Okay, so we have verse 42 in very literal English. And cover upon him the Cohen with ram, the guilt, to faces Yahweh upon sin he that sinned, and will be forgiven to he from sin he that sinned. It is very, very literal, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense. But remember, the question is guilty of what? Because the last verse said that the person who is guilty, it is written in the masculine. So it does mean. Ooh. Sorry. I guess we're going to have to try changing out the cord this week. I was sure it was the turning on the offy thing, but apparently it's not. Could be the microphone for all I know. It's very old. Anyway, so we have and cover upon him the Cohen with the ram, the guilt to faces Yahweh, sin he that sin, and he will be forgiven to he from sin he that sin. And I was saying that it's written in the masculine. So you shouldn't write she instead of he. You shouldn't do that because then, the reason why they're saying, well, we got to put she in there. Well, why? Well, because you get the idea that this is only written to men. Well, then if you put she in there, you get the idea that it's only written to women. So then it's like, well, let's put they in there. Well, then that's going to cause other linguistical issues. 100 years from now, people are going to think that certain things are only for men and certain things are only for women and certain things are for both. It doesn't work that way. Let's just leave that part alone. But just know that this covers men and women. It's the same for both. So we have all of these rules, these things that we're supposed to live by, and we've broken them. It's not the end of the world. None of these things are heaven and hell issues. There's only one, biblically speaking, there's only one thing that you could actually call a heaven and hell issue. Just one. And none of them are listed in this chapter. Or that is not listed in this chapter because there's only one. So none of these things are what you would call something like that. And so what happens is that God gives us the way to fix these things. If you've done this wrong, this is, if you messed up this particular law, here's what you do to make it right. Isn't that great? That's what you call grace. That's actual grace. Anyway, better go on before I get myself in trouble. So it starts off with vaYiqra, which is to cover, a covering, to overspread something. And it's even used of spreading, like when you're doing a roof, they used to put pitch over the top, or I don't know if they put it all the way over it or if they just used it to hold it together, or whatever the deal is, because pretty sure they didn't have roofs like that back when this was written. So when you're looking at the dictionary, you have to sometimes know some of these things don't go back that far. I don't know that anyone used pitch at that time. If they did, it wasn't for this purpose, because they didn't build houses like we think of back then. So anyway, but you get the idea with the pitch. It's to cover over something. It's to, once it's covered over with pitch, you can't see it anymore. Yeah, I mean, the roof is there, right? But you can't see whatever was the pitch covered over. You can't really know for sure. Is that pitch over straw? Is it over plywood? Is it over sticks? If it's covered well enough, you don't know what's under it unless you can go inside and look up. Then you'll probably see it, because they didn't do insulation back in those days either, by the way. So, but the idea is you're covering over. It's like today, one of the things you see on those funny and cute video things that you'll watch on YouTube, where somebody will stand in the doorway of a hallway with a blanket and call their dog and get it to sit there and look at them. And then they distract the dog and they step out of the way where the dog can't see them and drop that blanket. And then it's as if to the dog, that person has disappeared. Yeah. The blanket over the top of you covers you up where you can't be seen. Now, looking at it, if you're a human, you may notice that you can tell there's a human under there, right? But a dog can't. We've seen this. And the person will just cover themselves up on the floor. And the dog will, they'll throw a ball, they'll cover themselves up laying on the floor, and then the dog comes running back and just starts searching for they're standing right by the person, and they're looking all over the place because the person was sitting in the chair a while ago, and now there's nobody in the chair. Where did that person go? And of course, it doesn't take long for that dog to figure it out, because they can smell, they can hear, and stuff like that better than we can. So they figure it out quickly. But they're covered over; they can't be seen. And that's the whole point I'm trying to make here. Just because something is covered over doesn't mean that somebody doesn't know what's under it. And that's important. And so we have this, we start off with the idea is a covering upon him or over him, more specifically. And then it says ha-Kohen, so the Kohen, the priest. Be'el, of course, that's ram, or with a ram. The be sound in front of it makes it ram, or with, rather. Then it says ha-Asham. So it's, you could say the guilt ram of guilt, or his guilt will be covered over with a ram. Well, I don't think you could say with a ram, but there's a connection here. We're going to understand it here in a minute. And then it says lipnei, so that's two. We would put the word two. Faces. It's in plural, faces. Because remember, in Hebrew, you don't talk about God and say the word face in singular, because God is alive and your face is always moving. Even if you're asleep, your face is always moving. So you don't speak of God when you say, even in using the word Elohim, which, by the way, does not mean God. Elohim means mighty hero, or, well, hero. And so it was used of David and his mighty heroes. They were called Elohim. Lots of people were called Elohim, not just God. It's a terrible translation. You shouldn't use, but the reason why they do is because the ultimate mighty hero is God. And so somewhere along the lines, the Jews used Elohim to describe God, even though they used Elohim to describe people like David, people like his mighty warriors, and Shlomo and Shaul and those guys that, around the time of David. That was a very common thing to call a man Elohim. Okay. But we're speaking, in this case, it's going to actually give God's name. And we're talking about the face of God. So we say faces because he's alive. And so when we say Elohim, we generally, we don't say El, is as it were. Well, L's not even singular. But we don't say God, if you will, in singular. We say it in plural. That doesn't mean that there are two gods. It doesn't mean that there are three gods. It doesn't mean that there are many gods. It has nothing to do with that. The reason why they say God in plural is because God is alive. If you say God in singular, you're actually talking about an idol. Because if you carve a happy face on that idol, it doesn't matter if you turn it upside down. That's not a frown. That's an upside down idol. It still has a happy face, no matter what you do. Until you start recarving on that thing, it's always going to have a happy face. It is dead. It is not alive. Spoken of in singular. God being alive is always spoken of in plural, and that is the only reason why it's written in plural in the Bible. It is not to indicate that there are three gods who live separate, three separate but equal beings who live together as one. That has nothing, that is paganism and has nothing to do with the Bible. God is spoken of in plural because God is alive. Okay, so then it says, of course, God's name Yahweh, and then we have all, which is over, upon, above. And this is chatato, so it's that sin, and then the O sound has been added to the end of it, so we would say his sin. In Hebrew, it's sin he, so we say his sin. Anyway, and sin is not to miss the mark. That is a horrific explanation of sin. I mean, horrific. Oh, it's supposed to hit the mark, but you missed the mark, and we call that sin. OMG. I wish to God, if anything had not wound up in the lexicons and Bible dictionaries, it would have been that one, because it is so far off the mark that they didn't even use bow and arrow. They just took the arrow and tossed it. No, the best explanation for what sin is and what sin is not is, and I've said this many times, I'm going to say it again right now. Your best way to understand what sin is and what it is not, whether you're Jew or you're Christian or whatever, this one verse that actually is found in the New Testament explains it, sums it up in a single verse better than anything any other rabbi has ever said. And by the way, this is the rabbi, the man who wrote this letter is the same rabbi who gave us the Mishnah. So Jews, you should be okay with this. Whether you believe in New Testament or not doesn't matter. This is a verse that every Jew should memorize for two reasons. One, get in the conversation with that Christian who's just absolutely going to convert you or condemn you to hell. You need this verse. Christians, you need to know it too, especially if you're of the Pentecostal variety, the old style, where the women had to wear sleeves down to their bottom, to the wrist side closest to your hand and down below your ankles and up to your necks, and the guys had to put their fingers on the edge of their ear, and if the hair was touching the top part, you were going to hell and all that stuff. And I know what I'm talking about. I was in the Pentecostal church as a kid for a few years. They told me I was going to hell quite often. So people who have come through that kind of thing, you definitely need to know what sin is and what it is not. I don't care who you are. If you're living in this world, you need to know what sin is and what it is not. So I want you to memorize this verse, at least the way I've translated it, because it's more accurate the way it's accurate the way I've done it. And it's actually accurate in the English, except that people don't know what they're reading. So I've used a different word because it's clear what's meant by it. It's found in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. 134. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. And this is my translation of that Greek text. Everyone who commits sin is also in rebellion of the Torah. Did you hear me? Everyone who commits sin is also in rebellion of the Torah, comma. That's not the end of the sentence. That's only part of it. Here's the rest of it. Because sin is Torah, rebellion. Everyone who commits sin is also in rebellion of the Torah, because sin is Torah, rebellion. You want to know what sin is and what it is not? That one verse answers all of it sums it up in a single verse. Because if the Torah says to do it and you don't, that's sin. If the Torah says not to do it and you do, that is sin. So for you Christians who say you don't live by the law, you live in sin. Pure and simple, you live in sin. And that comes from the New Testament. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. So for you Jews like me who came up, learning the sages and all of that kind of stuff, this is why we need to know this. Remember, this is the man who gave us the Mishnah, the book that from that we get the Talmud, the writings of the sages. They're all commenting on something that man wrote, and that man wrote these words. Everyone who commits sin is also in rebellion of the Torah, because sin is Torah, rebellion. And so all that nonsensical stuff that we're told about putting an Easter egg on our plate, I find that abhorrent, because there is no part of that Easter egg being on the Jewish plate that should be there. What most of us didn't know, what I didn't know, was that by the time that stuff was about, you had Jews who did not speak Hebrew. The sages, most of the sages, particularly the ones in the time of Maimon and Rashi and those guys between, say, the late 1100s into the early 1300s. Those are the vast majority of what we learn from the Talmud. That's where most of that came from. Not all of it, but most of it. These are guys, not one of them, Maimon, Rashi, none of those men spoke one word of Hebrew, not one word. They spoke Arabic or Aramaic. Maimon was, I think, fluent in both Arabic and Aramaic, which shouldn't surprise you given where he was from and who he worked with and what he did. But he didn't speak Hebrew. And for those of you who say, but I've read it, and there's this story about how this guy asked him about Hebrew. Read it again. Go on about, one more page past that, and you'll realize, because I did that, I didn't stop reading after that passage. I just kept on, flipped the page and read the next page. It becomes very clear when you get to the next page that he never spoke a word of Hebrew. But I digress. These men didn't speak Hebrew. They did not know what the Jewish customs, culture, and history were. No, they did not. As close as the history as they could come was what they got out of the Bible. Well, that's some pretty good historical information, correct? But and you get some custom from that as well. But what you don't know from reading that, and by the way, this is before the printing press, so they didn't have the whole Bible. They couldn't just go out and get a Tanakh and open it up and read Isaiah and whatever they wanted to read that day. No, they had to read whatever scroll they could get their hands on, and those were very expensive, and most people didn't have them all. Yeah, that was still going on during the sages. So some of those people never got to read Isaiah. Some of those people never got to read Hosea. Some of those people never got to read Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, the names we use now. Maybe they only had Leviticus. Yeah, that was common back then for them to only have one. And if you were only going to get one and you were going to have to save up and pay a year's worth of your salary to get one, you're going to pick probably Leviticus. That's the most common one. If you wanted to read the other ones, you generally had to go to a synagogue, because people would die and they would hand those documents off to their synagogues. And eventually the synagogues would have most of them. A really big one in Jerusalem would probably have all of them and then some. But in a smaller town, you'd be lucky if they had more than one or two or three. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? These people did not have the Bible. They did not speak the language. They knew nothing about the customs, the culture, and the history. So you know where they got them? They got them from the Catholics. Almost everything Rashi ever said, he stole from the Catholics. He saw the connection between what the Catholics were doing and what he was reading in the Aramaic. Not in the Hebrew, the Aramaic. So he's seeing these connections and he's laying out, well, this is how you live out the Bible. And this is where we get the Talmud. This is where we get the commentary from the sages and that sort of thing. So what is very, very much missed by Judaism today is those Jews that we're leaning upon knew nothing about Judaism. They made it up. They had to make it up. The Jews had been kicked out of Israel. Their temple had been destroyed. And they were not just a long way from Israel, they were a long way from their history, their customs, their culture. And think about it, even if it had been passed down from one parent to the, dad to son, to son, to son, to son, to son. I don't know how to say that, but you know what I'm saying? Even if it had been passed down, have you ever played that little game where somebody whispers something into the person at the front of the row and it goes down and around, from one kid to the other, and by the time you get to the other side of the room, it's nothing like what was said to begin with? That's what happens when you don't have any part of that written down. That's what happens. So there's way too many Jews living by these customs and these cultures that were literally stolen from Catholicism, having no idea that that's where it came from, and having no idea that not only is it not biblical, it's in complete conflict with the biblical text. There's a lot of it that way. No, not all of it's that way, but there's an awful lot of it that is. And so that Easter egg thing really bugs me, because somebody saw that they were eating Easter eggs. Eggs were the easiest thing for them to get for nourishment. It's certainly a lot easier than having to make bread. So it got added in. They connected it to a couple of verses in the Bible and made some stories up about it. And the next thing you know, the Easter egg has found its way into the Pesach. Wow. Sin. Because they're putting idol worship into our Pesach. That's what they did. So we know that it's sin because it's against God's law. Anyway, so if God said do it, you don't, you're a sinner. If God says don't do it and you do, you're a sinner. It's that simple. Probably shouldn't have stayed on that long. Anyway, so we have Asher Chata, speaking of that sin. But the nislach, and will be forgiven. So if that covering is made, if that blood is shed from that ram, that covering is made. And it says here, there will be forgiveness. It's to pardon. It's probably what you think of as forgiveness. It's to show mercy, be God showing us mercy. It's a pardon, if you will, kinda. Primary idea seems to be that of lightness, lifting up. It is from salah, which is to suspend a balance, to weigh. In other words, when you commit a sin, and this is a really good way to look at it, you're out of balance. You're on a scale, and that scale is just plummeted to the bottom. Now, something needs to be added to the other side to bring you back into balance. So God is telling us that we come before the tent. The priest helps us to make this sacrifice. And from that sacrifice, forgiveness will be found. But it's very important that we remember what I said about the covering. You can still see that that lump on the floor under that blanket is a human being. It's very important to remember that. So we have lo, which is not the word. It's two letters that have been put together, are not always a word in Hebrew. This means to he, literally, to him, to it, can be the same thing. Trying to speak, but my throat's trying to cough. I'm trying not to do that. Mechatato, from sin he. So we have he'll be forgiven from his sin, or she. Again, it's written in the masculine, so both men and women are covered. Sorry, I just can't not cough. This is asher chata, which that sin. So we've already said that one time. It's being said a second time. So here's my translation. And the Cohen will cover over him, speaking of the guilty, with the ram of the guilt offering in the presence of Yahweh. That's to the faces, in the presence of Yahweh. And then I have in, why don't you go to the picture-in-picture for me, if you will. It should just hit the play button. The little triangle thing. Yeah. There's one button that says pick in pick, and that's got to be highlighted, and then you hit the what looks like a play button on an old cassette deck. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so let's just back up a little bit. And the Cohen will cover over him. And then, of course, I put that little thing in parentheses so that you know who the him is, the one who's guilty. The Cohen will cover over him. The Cohen will cover over him. The Cohen is his covering. With the ram of the guilt offering. So it says in the okay, then we have in the, that's what is actually said, or before the literally it says two faces. And so we say in the presence of Yahweh. And then I've added another couple of square brackets here. And I had the curse, what's that called? It's not called cursive. When your letters are squiggly. Italics. You have this word in italics because I'm trying to help you understand what this sentence means but still at the same time trying to let you know it doesn't actually have words for this. Am I adding to the Bible or taking away? No. If I don't put this in there, I am taking away. I'm taking away your ability to understand what was said. So I have to add these words, but I want you to know that those words weren't there originally. Why weren't they there, Rob? Well, because in Hebrew, they're not necessary. In English, they are. So it says, a covering over the sin that he sinned, and he will be forgiven for the sin that he sinned. He will be forgiven. So if you have that Cohen to help you make that sacrifice, the Cohen is literally the covering. He is literally like the blanket over the person laying on the floor. That doesn't mean that God's like a dumb dog and can't find that person. Don't make that connection, hopefully. But no, it's your sin doesn't go away. Moshe is still a murderer. To this day, 5,000 years later. No, that wasn't 5,000 years ago. 3,500 years later. Abraham was 5,000. Still, it's never going to go away. He still murdered a man. David, he's not only did he get another man's wife pregnant, he tried to cover it up by getting that man killed. So he's a murderer and an adulterer to this day. Is he in heaven? Of course he is. And so is Moshe. Why? Because there was a covering. A sacrifice was made for their sin. And that priest who made that sacrifice for them covered over them, was the covering. Was that some priest that lived in their time? No. Mm-mm. God made that sacrifice. God was the priest. There's argument about, well, until Mashiach comes, there is no cover, no priest that could cover that sort of thing. And then there's the argument, well, it's usually Jesus was that priest and made that covering. And I say, well, okay, that's all fine and good. Maybe it was. But if you're Jewish and don't accept that, some Jews do, some don't. But let's say you don't accept it. Well, then how did Moshe get to heaven? How did David get to heaven? Because without that covering, there's no forgiveness. And without forgiveness, you're not going to get there, right? So, you see, when God said that he was going to make that sacrifice, and he did, it's in Yirmiyahu, in case you don't know. It's in Hosea, in case you don't know. It's several places. But God said it. And so we know that when God says it, it's done. Even if we have to wait 550 bazillion, quadrillion, bajillion, light years away, it's done. So it really doesn't matter from a Jewish point of view, from a, we hate Jesus Jewish point of view, or we don't accept Jesus Jewish point of view. It doesn't matter. God said it. Therefore, that sacrifice has been made. Whether it's going to be made in the future or at some point in the past that we don't know about, it was made, or even if it was Jesus who made it, God did it. His word is done. So they're there in spite of the fact that they committed these egregious sins, in spite of the fact that they weren't put to death for making those sins, because isn't that what the Bible says? If you murder, it literally in Hebrew, the way that sentence lays out, that should have been murder. It's more like shed innocent blood would actually be a better translation of moot, because that's the word that's used in that sentence. But it's still murder, right? So they committed this murder, and how is it that they could go to heaven having no covering? Now you know. All right. This section of scripture started off commanding us to be holy. It is not saying that we must only follow these ordinances to be holy. It is simply summing up holiness. That said, the focus of this verse is not what we do when we become unholy. The focus is on the sin itself. Biblical Hebrew has no punctuation marks. The way a sentence is written identifies that which we in the West think of as punctuation. Sorry. I don't know why I couldn't spit that out. The way a sentence is written identifies that which we in the West think of as punctuation. So the way it's written tells us whether there should be an explanation point. The way it's written tells us whether that's the end of the sentence. It tells us maybe we should put a comma there, right? The way the sentence is laid out, the combination of the way the words, of the order of the words, and the little letters, if you will, that we add to the front, the middle, or the end of each word actually gives us all that information. It's why we didn't have punctuation. We didn't need it. It's literally in the words. In this case, the fact that the word chata, which means sin, appears 4 times is done to add emphasis and focus on the sin. Do you notice it's in there 4 times? Introspection on our part concerning our sin becomes extremely important. We must recognize what sin is and what it is not, so that we can avoid it in our lives. Still, God knows that we will all fall short from time to time, but has, by his mercy, given us a way to correct our course and purify ourselves so that we can live a holy life even after we have failed. That's pretty good stuff. Oh, man. Oh, and this is a long one, too. Not sure what to do now. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm spending so much time on these things like I am and trying to go into all this kind of detail. You know, maybe it's God doing it to me. I doubt that. I think I'm just being long-winded. But it's important that we understand, one, that this verse was all about the sin and had very little to do with the forgiveness. As exciting as it is from our point of view to have the forgiveness is not like there's a verse in the New Testament that says he's thrown your sin as far as the east is from the west or something like that. I don't remember how it goes, but it's along those lines. And so from that, Christianity has developed this idea that it is as if you have never committed a sin. No, it is not. You committed that sin. That sin is going to be with you forever, not just the rest of your life, forever. But that's okay if you have forgiveness. That's okay if you have a covering. That's okay if you have a sacrifice. It's not okay for you to do it again. And it really wasn't okay that you did it, obviously. But see, the grace and the law in the New Testament are very, very mixed up because of the translators, not because of the writers. I've translated the New Testament and it's correct. The way it's written is, of course, that's if you understand the law, then you can read it and you understand what those guys meant when they started talking about not living under the law, but living under grace. The law teaches us how to live. Grace is what we live by. But that doesn't get rid of the law, because without the law, grace will do you no good, because the grace is tied to the law. Do you follow? You commit a sin, and without the ability to correct that sin, the grace does nothing for you. It is the grace that gives you that. That is the grace. The Bible, the New Testament, I should say, does not ever pit grace against the law. Never. At least as written as we see it in the Greek. In English, yes, it does. And it's awful. It's awful how that was translated, because it's now got the church thinking that, okay, so God, he gets his people, he gives them a law, they blow it, he kicks them out, he takes on the Christians, and they don't have to live by a law. Well, why didn't God just say, okay, the law is obviously not going to work, you Jews are okay, you're good to go? Really? Sometimes we don't think some of these things through, because the first thing you hear from a Christian when you say something like that, oh, no, that's not what we believe. Yes, it is. It is exactly what you believe. You just don't state it that way. You've just never heard it that way, perhaps, but it's exactly what you believe. God does not change. His law does not change. If it was a sin for Moshe, and it's the guy you know as Moses, sorry about that, it's a sin for you, and it'll be sin for every generation to come. It will never not be a sin. The sin sacrifice that is made by God, and if you're a Christian and you believe in Jesus and you believe that that was a manifestation of God in the flesh, which I wish all Christians understood that, because they think that some actually think God had sex with Mary and their child is half God, half man. Most people don't think that. I was surprised at how many people actually thought that over the years, carefully asking that question to see what they believe. It's amazing how many people think that happened. Other people say, well, no, it wasn't sex. God just somehow, did something to her, and somehow that's but they still believe he's half God and half man, or half human. But what they say is that he was all human and all man. That all human and all God. I stand corrected. I didn't realize I did that. That's half man, half God. Any way you slice it. That's not all God, all man. It's half man, half God. That is terrible. That is absolutely terrible. And all you have to do is read what the prophet said. And funny enough, right there in the beginning of the New Testament, they quote the prophet. For unto us a child is given, a son is born. Maybe a son is born, a child is given. I forget how it goes. And he'll do this, that, and the other. But it ends up with, he'll be called Wonderful, Counselor, Prince of Peace, Almighty God. The Son. God will be the Son. This is the mistake in the translation. God will be the Son. The Son, God will not have a son. God will be born as the Son. And because they didn't understand that, the translators, they would talk about Yeshua as the Son of God. Well, yeah, that's an idiom. The Son of God means you're Israeli. Just read Genesis, where Moshe first encounters God at the point of, I'm going to send you into the people. When he's actually at the point of going in, God says, you go to Pharaoh and you say, let my son go. Look it up. It says it. I think it's let my son Israel. It may say, I don't remember what the English says. It'll either say, let my son Israel go, or let my son go. My son, the Son of God, is Israel. Okay? You get that? And so when they called him the Son of God, they either meant that he was Israeli, or the Son of God was also the servant of God, because there's a difference between abadah, which is servant, as in we shouldn't think of it as a slave. That's really the wrong English word for that. The Avodah is the person who, like, I want to say Mother Mary. That's not right. The lady who took care of all the Mother Teresa. That's what we're talking about. That's that's somebody who gives up their life to serve. That's not what the word that's being used here. The word is ben, the word for son. And so what are we talking about? Well, if you have a rabbi who's teaching you in yeshiva and you have learned from this rabbi in that yeshiva, and he eventually gives you your papers and essentially makes you a rabbi. It's called ordination in English. You are the son of that rabbi, even though you're not related to that rabbi. Maybe you're even older than that rabbi. You're his son. Why? Because what you're going to teach as the person who studied under that rabbi is what that rabbi taught you. You're not going to go out and make your own stuff up. That's not a son. The son teaches what the rabbi taught him. The son lives his life exactly the same way his rabbi lived his life. He probably, by the time he graduates, makes the same faces and expressions that that rabbi makes. It happens, and it should happen, because you're supposed to emulate that rabbi, everything, the way he lived, the way he thought, what he taught. It should all be exactly what that rabbi taught you. That's a son. So when they call Yeshua the Son of God, what are they saying? If they're not calling him Israeli, and there are times in the New Testament where they literally mean Israeli when they say that, but most of the time when they call him the Son of God, it's because here we have a human being who does exactly the same thing God does. He lives his life exactly the same way God does. The Son of God. Well, let's see. He raised the dead. God does that. He made the blind to see. God does that. He made the deaf to hear. God does that. He walks on water. Well, I'm taking a guess here, but I imagine God could do that too, right? So this Son of God did not mean that God had a child. God was the child in human form. That's why we could see him, see God, and not die. Because you're not seeing all of God. You're only seeing one attribute of God, the physical attribute of God. And in this case, it's human form. God is way more than that. But that's that one little attribute of God that people got to see for a very short period of time. So that's the Son. So it's good to imitate the lifestyle of that man who is now very wrongly called Jesus. His name was Yeshua, not Yahweh, Jamahuka, all that other nonsense that the sacred names people came up with. It was Yeshua. Clear and simple Yeshua. Not Yehoshua, and shortened to Yeshua. He was called Yeshua. That was his name. Because he would bring salvation to many. Yeshua. So we need to be introspective. We need to look into our lives and make sure that we live our lives the way God lived his life. And if you are Christian and want to do that with Jesus, that's okay, because that was God. You'll get it right so long as you understand he lived according to his law, because his law is his way of life. It always has been. It always will be. God will never commit adultery. He will never steal. He will never commit murder. He has never committed murder. He is not jealous, petty and jealous. That's a translator that said that, not the Bible, not as it was written in Hebrew anyway. Uh-oh, I wasn't watching my timer. We'll pick up with the idea of holiness next week. We got a few other things to get to. Shalom and shalom, everybody.
The blessing, vaYiqra. Yevarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.